Question 1. Compliance review shows a law enforcement security officer, LISO, patrolling a federal courthouse in Houston, Texas, observes two individuals exhibiting nervous behavior and repeatedly looking at their watches while standing near a public entrance. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the LISO to take? Option A. Initiate a general alert to all security personnel regarding suspicious individuals without further specific assessment. Option B. Immediately approach the individuals and demand identification and an explanation for their presence and behavior. Option C. Discreetly observe the individuals from a distance to gather more information about their behavior and potential intent before taking any direct action. Option D. Continue with routine patrol duties, assuming the behavior is not indicative of a security threat. Correct answer is C. Discreetly observe the individuals from a distance to gather more information about their behavior and potential intent before taking any direct action. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the law enforcement security officer, LISO, to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for disruption and the rights of individuals. LISO must make a rapid assessment of a situation that could escalate, impacting the safety and operational integrity of a federal facility in Texas. Careful judgment is required to ensure that security measures are effective without being overly intrusive or discriminatory. The best approach involves conducting a discreet, initial observation to gather information about the suspicious activity without immediately confronting the individuals. This allows the LISO to assess the nature and severity of the potential threat, consider the environment, and determine the most appropriate response based on established FPS protocols and federal law. This method prioritizes de-escalation and evidence gathering, ensuring that any subsequent action is justified and proportionate to the observed risk. This aligns with the FPS mission to protect federal facilities and personnel by employing a risk-based security strategy that emphasizes situational awareness and measured response. An incorrect approach would be to immediately detain the individuals based solely on their perceived nervousness and unusual behavior. This action could be premature and potentially violate individuals' rights if no concrete evidence of a threat exists, leading to a complaint of profiling or excessive force. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the behavior and continue with routine patrols without further investigation. This fails to uphold the LISO duty to identify and mitigate potential security risks, potentially leaving the facility vulnerable to a threat. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to broadcast a general alert to all personnel about suspicious individuals without specific details or a clear threat assessment. This could cause unnecessary panic and disruption without providing actionable intelligence for other officers. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with observation and information gathering. This is followed by an assessment of the risk based on observed facts and established protocols. The next step involves selecting a response that is proportionate to the identified risk, prioritizing de-escalation and minimizing disruption. Finally, documentation of the incident and the response is crucial for accountability and future analysis. Question 2. Compliance review shows a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer, LISO, is stationed at a federal facility in Illinois. The officer observes an individual loitering near a restricted access area, exhibiting nervous behavior and repeatedly glancing at their watch. The officer has no specific intelligence regarding this individual or any immediate threat to the facility. What is the most appropriate risk assessment-driven approach for the LISO to take? Option A. Immediately detain the individual and conduct a full pat-down search based on their nervous behavior and loitering. Option B. Ignore the individual's behavior as it does not constitute a direct, overt threat to avoid unnecessary escalation. Option C. Approach the individual, politely inquire about their purpose at the facility, and observe their demeanor and responses to assess potential risk. Option D. Report the individual's presence to the facility manager and request they handle the situation to avoid direct engagement. Correct answer is C. Approach the individual, politely inquire about their purpose at the facility, and observe their demeanor and responses to assess potential risk. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the law enforcement security officer, LISO, to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for overreach and infringement on protected rights. The FPS operates under specific federal regulations and guidelines, emphasizing a risk-based approach to security. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing threats and implementing proportionate security measures without unduly restricting access or causing unnecessary alarm. The best approach involves a systematic and documented risk assessment process. This means identifying potential threats, analyzing their likelihood and impact, and then developing security strategies that directly address those identified risks. This aligns with FPS directives that mandate a proactive, intelligence-driven security posture. By focusing on observable behaviors and credible intelligence, the officer can justify any security interventions. This method ensures that actions are not arbitrary, but are grounded in a professional evaluation of the security environment, thereby upholding both security mandates and individual rights. An approach that relies solely on generalized suspicion or profiling is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the standard of a risk-based assessment and can lead to discriminatory practices, which are contrary to FPS policy and ethical law enforcement principles. Implementing security measures without a clear, documented link to a specific, assessed risk is an overreach of authority. Another unacceptable approach is to ignore potential security indicators due to a desire to avoid confrontation or perceived inconvenience. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to the fundamental duty of protecting federal property and personnel. Security is not optional. It requires vigilance and appropriate action when indicators suggest a potential threat. Finally, an approach that involves escalating security measures without a clear, escalating threat justification is also problematic. While vigilance is necessary, disproportionate responses can erode public trust and create an environment of unnecessary fear. Security measures must be calibrated to the level of assessed risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with threat identification, followed by a thorough risk assessment. This assessment should inform the selection and implementation of security measures. Documentation of the assessment and the rationale for chosen actions is crucial for accountability and continuous improvement. When in doubt, consulting with supervisors or relevant security personnel is a professional and responsible step. Question 3. The audit findings indicate that an FPS law enforcement security officer stationed at a federal courthouse in Houston, Texas, observes an individual loitering near a restricted access point, exhibiting nervous behavior and repeatedly glancing at their watch. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the officer to take to assess the situation and maintain security? Option A. Discreetly observe the individual's behavior and surroundings to gather more information before initiating contact, and if the behavior escalates or presents a clear threat, professionally approach the individual, identify themselves, and request an explanation and identification. Option B. Confront the individual aggressively, demanding to know their purpose and threatening immediate arrest if they do not comply with all demands. Option C. Immediately detain the individual and escort them to a secure area for questioning based on their suspicious behavior and proximity to a restricted area. Option D. Ignore the individual's behavior, assuming it is not a threat, and continue with routine patrols to avoid unnecessary escalation. The correct answer is A. Discreetly observe the individual's behavior and surroundings to gather more information before initiating contact, and if the behavior escalates or presents a clear threat, professionally approach the individual, identify themselves, and request an explanation and identification. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the FPS law enforcement security officer to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for overreach and infringement on protected rights. The officer must make a judgment call based on incomplete information, where a hasty or overly aggressive response could have significant legal and ethical repercussions, while a passive approach might compromise security. The specific context of a federal facility in Texas, governed by federal laws and FPS directives, adds a layer of complexity requiring strict adherence to established protocols. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a measured and systematic approach to risk assessment. This begins with immediate observation and information gathering to establish a baseline of normal activity. Upon noticing an anomaly, the officer should discreetly observe the individual and their behavior to determine if it constitutes a credible threat or a benign deviation from the norm. If the behavior escalates or presents a clear and present danger, the officer should then initiate contact in a professional and non-confrontational manner, clearly identifying themselves and their purpose, and requesting identification and an explanation for the behavior. This approach prioritizes de-escalation, adherence to due process, and the collection of sufficient information before taking any further action, aligning with FPS guidelines on threat assessment and lawful engagement. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately detain the individual based solely on the observation of unusual behavior without further assessment. This fails to account for the possibility that the behavior is not indicative of a threat and could lead to an unlawful detention, violating the individual's rights and potentially exposing the FPS to legal liability. It bypasses the crucial steps of observation and information gathering necessary for a proper risk assessment. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the behavior entirely, assuming it is not a threat. This neglects the officer's fundamental duty to maintain security and protect federal property and personnel. A failure to assess and respond to potentially suspicious activity, even if it turns out to be benign, represents a dereliction of duty and could have severe security consequences if the behavior was indeed indicative of a threat. A third incorrect approach is to immediately escalate to a highly confrontational stance, demanding answers and potentially using force without a clear and present danger established. This can provoke an unnecessary escalation of the situation, compromise the officer's safety, and violate the principles of de-escalation and professional conduct expected of FPS officers. It demonstrates a lack of judgment and an inability to conduct a nuanced risk assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that begins with situational awareness and observation. They must then apply established protocols for threat assessment, which involve gathering information, analyzing behavior against known threat indicators, and considering the context of the environment. If a potential threat is identified, the framework dictates a phased approach to engagement, prioritizing de-escalation, clear communication, and lawful procedures. This ensures that actions are proportionate to the perceived risk and are grounded in legal and ethical principles. Question 4. The monitoring system demonstrates an unusual pattern of activity near a restricted access point at a federal courthouse in Chicago, Illinois, which could indicate a potential security breach or unauthorized access attempt. As a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer, what is the most appropriate initial course of action to mitigate potential risks while adhering to FPS directives and federal regulations? Option A. Conduct a discrete visual assessment of the area to verify the anomaly, consult relevant FPS standard operating procedures for access point security, and if the anomaly persists and indicates a potential threat, escalate the situation according to established protocols, including notifying a supervisor and potentially increasing surveillance. Option B. Immediately initiate a full facility lockdown and alert all personnel to evacuate, citing a potential security breach based solely on the monitoring system's alert. Option C. Proceed directly to the restricted access point alone to investigate the anomaly, attempting to apprehend any individuals involved without first assessing the situation or requesting backup. Option D. Disregard the anomaly as a likely system malfunction or false alarm, as direct intervention without concrete evidence could lead to unnecessary disruption. The correct answer is A. Conduct a discrete visual assessment of the area to verify the anomaly, consult relevant FPS standard operating procedures for access point security, and if the anomaly persists and indicates a potential threat, escalate the situation according to established protocols, including notifying a supervisor and potentially increasing surveillance. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential security vulnerability, presenting a professionally challenging scenario for a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk posed by the anomaly, balancing the need for immediate action with the potential for overreaction, and ensuring compliance with FPS directives and federal regulations governing the protection of federal facilities in the United States. The officer must exercise sound judgment to prevent unauthorized access or interference while respecting the rights of authorized personnel and the public. The best approach involves a systematic, multi-layered risk assessment process. This begins with immediate but controlled observation and verification of the anomaly. The officer should then consult relevant FPS standard operating procedures, SOP, and threat assessment guidelines to categorize the potential risk. This includes considering the nature of the anomaly, its location within the facility, the time of day, and any intelligence available regarding potential threats. Based on this assessment, the officer should escalate the situation according to established protocols, which may involve notifying supervisors, requesting additional resources, or implementing specific security measures. This methodical process ensures that actions taken are proportionate to the identified threat, aligned with federal law and FPS policy, and documented appropriately. An incorrect approach would be to immediately initiate a lockdown of the entire facility without further investigation. This is a disproportionate response that could disrupt essential government functions, cause undue alarm, and potentially violate the rights of individuals within the facility. It fails to adhere to the principle of graduated response and lacks the necessary risk assessment to justify such a drastic measure. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the anomaly, assuming it is a false alarm or insignificant. This demonstrates a failure to uphold the duty of care and could have severe consequences if the anomaly represents a genuine security threat. It directly contravenes FPS directives to maintain vigilance and proactively address potential vulnerabilities. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to confront the anomaly directly and without backup or proper assessment. This could place the officer in unnecessary danger and may not effectively resolve the situation. It bypasses established protocols for threat management and resource allocation, potentially leading to an escalation of the incident. The professional reasoning process for such situations should involve 1. Immediate observation and situational awareness. 2. Adherence to established FPS SOPs and risk assessment matrices. 3. Consultation with supervisors and relevant intelligence. 4. Proportionate and graduated response based on assessed risk. And 5. Thorough documentation of all actions and observations. Question 5. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a full facility lockdown for any reported suspicious activity is often overly burdensome. In a situation where an FPS law enforcement security officer in a federal building in Washington, D.C., receives a credible but unconfirmed report of a suspicious package in a public area, what is the most prudent course of action? Option A. Initiate a phased evacuation of the immediate area. Establish a secure perimeter and immediately notify the appropriate specialized units and building management for further assessment and response. Option B. Continue with routine patrols and observe the area from a distance, assuming the report may be a false alarm unless further immediate evidence of danger arises. Option C. Immediately order a complete lockdown of the entire federal building, preventing all entry and exit until the situation is fully resolved. Option D. Approach the reported suspicious package directly to visually inspect it and determine its nature before reporting it to superiors. The correct answer is A. Initiate a phased evacuation of the immediate area, establish a secure perimeter, and immediately notify the appropriate specialized units and building management for further assessment and response. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the FPS law enforcement security officer to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for disruption and the ethical considerations of public access. The officer must make a rapid assessment of a credible threat while minimizing unnecessary impact on legitimate activities and respecting individual rights. The dynamic nature of security threats means that a rigid, predetermined response might be ineffective or even counterproductive. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a layered risk assessment that prioritizes immediate safety while gathering information to inform the most appropriate response. This approach begins with a clear, immediate threat assessment, followed by a proportional response that escalates based on verified information. It emphasizes communication with relevant authorities and stakeholders to ensure a coordinated and effective security posture. This aligns with the FPS's mandate to protect federal facilities and personnel, which requires a judicious application of security measures based on the specific threat environment. The ethical imperative is to protect life and property while upholding the principles of due process and minimizing undue interference with lawful activities. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately implementing a full lockdown of the entire facility without further assessment. This is an overreaction that could cause significant disruption, panic, and inconvenience to innocent individuals, potentially undermining public trust and operational continuity. It fails to consider the proportionality of the response to the verified threat level. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the report as a potential false alarm and continue with routine patrols. This demonstrates a failure to take a credible threat seriously, potentially exposing individuals to grave danger and violating the FPS's core duty to protect. It represents a dereliction of duty and a significant ethical lapse. A third incorrect approach is to engage directly with the reported suspicious individual without proper backup or communication with command. This exposes the officer to unnecessary personal risk and could escalate the situation unpredictably, potentially leading to harm to the officer, the individual, or the public. It bypasses established protocols for threat management and officer safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with threat identification and assessment. This involves gathering as much information as possible from reliable sources, evaluating the credibility and severity of the threat, and considering the potential impact of various response options. The decision-making framework should prioritize officer safety, the safety of the public, and the protection of assets. It should also incorporate established protocols for communication, escalation, and coordination with other agencies and personnel. The goal is to achieve the most effective security outcome with the least necessary disruption. Question 6. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in minor security breaches and unauthorized access attempts at a federal courthouse in Houston, Texas over the past quarter. As a law enforcement security officer, LESO, responsible for the facility's security, what is the most effective risk assessment approach to address this trend? Option A. Conduct a detailed analysis of incident reports to identify patterns, common locations, times, and contributing factors, then develop targeted mitigation strategies based on these findings. Option B. Immediately increase random patrols throughout the entire facility to deter potential offenders. Option C. Focus all efforts on apprehending individuals responsible for the recent breaches, assuming this will act as a sufficient deterrent. Option D. Advise facility management that the increase is likely a temporary fluctuation, and no immediate action is required beyond standard patrols. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed analysis of incident reports to identify patterns, common locations, times, and contributing factors, then develop targeted mitigation strategies based on these findings. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in reported security incidents at a federal facility in Texas. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a law enforcement security officer, LESO, to move beyond simple incident reporting and engage in proactive risk assessment to prevent future occurrences. The LESO must balance the immediate need to address current issues with the strategic imperative of identifying and mitigating underlying vulnerabilities. Careful judgment is required to allocate resources effectively and prioritize actions that will have the greatest impact on overall security posture, adhering to Federal Protective Service (FPS) directives. The best approach involves a systematic analysis of the incident data to identify patterns, root causes, and potential vulnerabilities. This includes reviewing the types of incidents, their locations, times, and any contributing factors. Based on this analysis, the LESO should then develop and implement targeted mitigation strategies, such as enhanced patrols in high-risk areas, improved lighting, or revised access control procedures. This proactive, data-driven approach aligns with FPS guidelines for risk management, which emphasize continuous improvement and the identification of systemic weaknesses rather than just reacting to individual events. The goal is to reduce the likelihood and impact of future incidents by addressing their fundamental causes. An incorrect approach would be to simply increase the number of patrols randomly without a clear understanding of where the risks are highest. This is inefficient and may not address the actual vulnerabilities contributing to the incidents. It fails to meet the FPS requirement for a risk-based approach to security operations. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on apprehending individuals involved in past incidents without investigating the underlying security gaps that allowed those incidents to occur. While apprehension is important, it does not prevent future incidents if the vulnerabilities remain unaddressed, thus failing to meet the FPS mandate for comprehensive risk mitigation. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the trend as a statistical anomaly without further investigation. This ignores the potential for escalating security threats and fails to uphold the LESO responsibility to maintain a secure environment as mandated by FPS regulations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with data collection and analysis. This involves understanding the scope and nature of the problem, identifying contributing factors, and then developing and implementing solutions based on a thorough risk assessment. Continuous monitoring and evaluation of implemented strategies are crucial to ensure their effectiveness and to adapt to evolving threats. Question 7. During the evaluation of a federal facility in Illinois, a law enforcement security officer observes an individual exhibiting unusual behavior near a restricted area. The individual is pacing, looking around frequently, and appears to be attempting to conceal a small object. Considering the Federal Protective Service, FPS, Law Enforcement Security Officer Assessment Guidelines, which of the following approaches represents the most professional and effective method for assessing the risk posed by this individual? Option A. Initiate a discrete but thorough risk assessment by observing the individual's actions for further indicators of intent, cross-referencing with any available real-time intelligence on potential threats to the facility, and preparing to engage the individual in a professional and non-confrontational manner if specific threat indicators escalate. Option B. Immediately detain the individual and conduct a full search based on the officer's subjective feeling that the individual's behavior is suspicious and potentially dangerous. Option C. Focus the assessment primarily on the individual's ethnic background and perceived social status, as these factors are often associated with potential security risks in certain areas. Option D. Ignore the behavior as it is likely just someone being nervous or unaware of facility rules, prioritizing the smooth flow of personnel and avoiding any potential complaints of harassment. The correct answer is A. Initiate a discrete but thorough risk assessment by observing the individual's actions for further indicators of intent, cross-referencing with any available real-time intelligence on potential threats to the facility, and preparing to engage the individual in a professional and non-confrontational manner if specific threat indicators escalate. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between maintaining security and respecting individual rights, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information or individuals. The FPS law enforcement security officer must exercise sound judgment to balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the imperative to avoid discriminatory practices or overreach. The potential for misinterpretation of behaviors or the escalation of minor issues into significant security concerns necessitates a nuanced and evidence-based approach. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves conducting a comprehensive risk assessment that focuses on observable behaviors, credible intelligence, and established security protocols, rather than relying on assumptions or stereotypes. This approach aligns with the Federal Protective Service's mandate to protect federal facilities and personnel by identifying and mitigating genuine threats. It emphasizes an objective, fact-based evaluation, ensuring that security measures are proportionate to the identified risks and are applied equitably, in accordance with federal law and FPS policy regarding non-discrimination and due process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately escalating a situation based on a vague sense of unease or perceived suspicious demeanor without concrete evidence. This can lead to unwarranted scrutiny, potential harassment, and a breakdown of trust, violating ethical principles of fairness and potentially infringing on civil liberties. It fails to adhere to the FPS requirement for actionable intelligence or observable indicators of threat. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss potential security concerns due to a desire to avoid any perception of profiling or to expedite access. While avoiding profiling is crucial, completely disregarding potential indicators of risk, especially when coupled with other concerning factors, can create vulnerabilities and compromise the safety of the facility and its occupants. This approach neglects the primary duty of the FPS officer to ensure security. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on an individual's appearance or background as the primary basis for a risk assessment. This is a direct violation of non-discrimination principles and FPS policy, which mandates that assessments be based on behavior and credible intelligence, not on protected characteristics. Such an approach is not only unethical, but also legally unsound and ineffective in identifying actual security threats. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective observation and evidence. This involves gathering information from multiple sources, assessing the credibility of that information, and evaluating it against established security threat indicators and protocols. When faced with ambiguity, the professional should seek clarification, consult with supervisors or relevant agencies, and always err on the side of caution while remaining within legal and ethical boundaries. The goal is to identify and mitigate genuine risks without infringing upon the rights of individuals. Question 8. What factors should a Federal Protective Service law enforcement security officer in the United States prioritize when assessing a potentially disruptive individual encountered in a federal facility to ensure a proportional and lawful response? Option A. Prioritizing verbal de-escalation and communication to understand the individual's intent and resolve the situation with minimal intervention while remaining aware of potential threats. Option B. Ignoring the individual's presence unless they directly violate a posted regulation, assuming no immediate security risk. Option C. Relying solely on the officer's perceived authority and the individual's compliance with the uniform to gain control of the situation. Option D. Immediately initiating physical detainment to prevent any potential disruption, regardless of the individual's behavior or verbal cues. The correct answer is A. Prioritizing verbal de-escalation and communication to understand the individual's intent and resolve the situation with minimal intervention, while remaining aware of potential threats. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a law enforcement security officer, LESO, to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for escalating a situation unnecessarily, all while operating within the specific legal framework of the Federal Protective Service, FPS, in the United States. The officer must accurately assess the threat level and respond proportionally, adhering to FPS policies and federal law regarding the use of force and de-escalation techniques. Misjudgment can lead to safety risks for the public, the officer, or damage to the reputation of the FPS. The best approach involves a systematic risk assessment that prioritizes de-escalation and minimal intervention, consistent with FPS policy and federal law. This means first attempting to verbally resolve the situation by engaging with the individual, understanding their concerns, and clearly communicating expectations and consequences. This approach aligns with FPS directives that emphasize officer safety, public safety, and the preservation of property through the least intrusive means necessary. It also reflects the ethical obligation to treat individuals with respect and dignity, even when enforcing regulations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate to a physical intervention or detainment, without attempting verbal de-escalation. This fails to meet the FPS requirement for proportional response and could be seen as an overreach of authority, potentially violating an individual's rights and creating unnecessary conflict. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation entirely, assuming it is not a threat. This neglects the officer's duty to maintain security and could allow a minor issue to escalate into a significant security breach, violating FPS mandates to protect federal property and personnel. Finally, an approach that relies solely on the perceived authority of the uniform, without attempting communication or understanding the individual's behavior, is also flawed. It demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and an unwillingness to engage in the critical de-escalation techniques that are a cornerstone of effective FPS law enforcement. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with observation and information gathering, followed by an assessment of the immediate threat and potential consequences. This should then lead to the selection of the least intrusive, yet effective, intervention strategy, prioritizing verbal de-escalation and communication before resorting to physical measures. Continuous re-evaluation of the situation and adherence to FPS policies and federal statutes are paramount throughout the process. Question 9. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of unauthorized access in a specific federal building wing. A law enforcement security officer, LESO, observes an individual loitering near a restricted access door in that wing, appearing agitated and carrying a nondescript bag. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the LESO in accordance with Federal Protective Service, FPS, guidelines? Option A. Continue routine patrol and monitor the area from a distance, assuming the individual will move on if they have no legitimate business. Option B. Initiate a high-visibility approach with drawn non-lethal restraint equipment to assert authority and deter any potential hostile action. Option C. Immediately detain the individual and secure the bag for a full search due to the potential threat indicated by the risk matrix. Option D. Approach the individual cautiously, observe their behavior, and attempt to engage them verbally to ascertain their purpose, and identify themselves as an FPS officer. The correct answer is D. Approach the individual cautiously, observe their behavior, and attempt to engage them verbally to ascertain their purpose, and identify themselves as an FPS officer. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the law enforcement security officer, LESO, to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for escalation and the rights of individuals. LESO must make a judgment call based on incomplete information and evolving circumstances, adhering to the Federal Protective Service, FPS, guidelines and relevant federal statutes. The risk matrix, while a tool, does not dictate a specific action without professional interpretation and situational awareness. The best approach involves a layered response that prioritizes de-escalation and information gathering while maintaining a secure perimeter. This aligns with FPS operational guidelines that emphasize threat assessment, communication, and the judicious use of force only when necessary and authorized. Specifically, FPS directives mandate that officers assess threats, attempt to de-escalate situations through verbal commands and communication, and only resort to physical intervention or apprehension when there is a clear and present danger or a violation of federal law or regulations. This approach respects individual rights while fulfilling the FPS mission of protecting federal property and personnel. An incorrect approach would be to immediately detain the individual based solely on their presence in a restricted area without further assessment. This fails to account for potential legitimate reasons for the individual's presence or the possibility of a misunderstanding. It could lead to an unwarranted use of force or an unlawful detention, violating federal statutes concerning civil rights and the proper procedures for apprehension. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the situation and continue with routine patrols. This demonstrates a failure to recognize and respond to a potential security breach, which is a direct contravention of the LESO duty to protect federal facilities and personnel. This inaction could allow a developing threat to materialize, leading to significant security compromises. Finally, an approach that involves immediate, aggressive confrontation without attempting verbal de-escalation or gathering more information is also professionally unacceptable. This escalates the situation unnecessarily, increases the risk of injury to both the individual and the officer, and may not be proportionate to the perceived threat. It bypasses crucial steps in threat assessment and de-escalation protocols mandated by FPS training. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with observation and assessment, followed by communication and de-escalation attempts. If these fail and a threat or violation is confirmed, then proportionate and authorized actions, including apprehension, should be considered. Throughout this process, adherence to FPS regulations, federal law, and ethical conduct is paramount. Question 10. Market research demonstrates that proactive threat identification and response are paramount for federal facility security. In Virginia, a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer, LESO, observes an individual attempting to bypass a security checkpoint by feigning a lost access card and exhibiting nervous behavior. The LESO has access to a standardized FPS risk assessment matrix that assigns a likelihood score L from 0, 1, very unlikely to 1, 0, highly likely, and an impact score I from 1, minor inconvenience, to 10, critical damage to life or property. If the LESO assesses the likelihood of unauthorized access as 0, 7, and the potential impact of a breach is 8. What is the minimum risk score that would necessitate immediate escalation to a Level 2 response, assuming a Level 2 response is triggered by a risk score greater than 5? Option A. A risk score calculated as /0, 7 times 8 which equals 5, 6, but only if the individual is known to have a prior security violation. Option B. A risk score calculated as /0, 7 plus 8 which equals 8, 7. Option C. A risk score calculated as /0, 7 plus 8 which equals 8, 7 and requires a supervisor's approval before escalation. Option D. A risk score calculated as /0, 7 times 8 which equals 5, 6. The correct answer is D. A risk score calculated as /0, 7 times 8 which equals 5, 6. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer, LESO, by requiring them to apply risk assessment principles to a dynamic situation involving potential unauthorized access to a federal facility in Virginia. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for immediate security with the accurate and efficient allocation of resources, especially when faced with incomplete information and the potential for escalating threats. A LESO must make swift, informed decisions that adhere to FPS directives and federal law while minimizing disruption and ensuring the safety of personnel and property. The correct approach involves a systematic, quantitative risk assessment that directly utilizes available data to inform resource deployment. This method begins by identifying the potential threat, unauthorized access, assessing its likelihood based on observed indicators, unusual activity, lack of credentials, and evaluating the potential impact, security breach, damage, injury. The LESO should then calculate a risk score using a standardized FPS risk matrix or formula, which might involve assigning numerical values to likelihood and impact factors. For instance, if the likelihood of unauthorized access is rated as high, e.g. 0.8 probability, and the potential impact is rated as critical, e.g. 10 units of damage, the risk score would be /0. 8 times 10 equals 8 /. This score directly dictates the level of response required, such as dispatching additional patrols, initiating a lockdown, or conducting a more thorough investigation. This quantitative approach is mandated by FPS operational guidelines, which emphasize data-driven decision-making to ensure consistent and effective security posture. It aligns with federal regulations concerning the protection of federal facilities and personnel, promoting an objective and justifiable allocation of security resources. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on subjective intuition or anecdotal evidence. For example, if the LESO decides to dispatch a full tactical response based on a gut feeling that the individual looks suspicious, without quantifying the threat or impact, this bypasses the established risk assessment protocols. This is a regulatory failure because it deviates from FPS directives that require objective risk evaluation. Ethically, it could lead to an overreaction, causing undue alarm, infringing on the rights of innocent individuals, and misallocating valuable security resources that could be better used elsewhere. Another incorrect approach is to delay the response indefinitely while attempting to gather exhaustive information. If the LESO decides to wait for a full background check and multiple confirmations before initiating any security measures, despite clear indicators of potential unauthorized access, this represents a critical failure in timely risk mitigation. This is a direct violation of the principle of proactive security and could result in a successful breach before any countermeasures are in place. The potential impact of such a delay, especially in a federal facility, is severe and unacceptable under FPS operational standards. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, multi-stage approach. First, immediately identify and report the potential threat. Second, gather all available observable data, no matter how seemingly minor. Third, apply the established FPS risk assessment framework, utilizing quantitative metrics where possible to calculate a risk score. Fourth, based on the calculated risk score, determine the appropriate level of response, adhering to predefined escalation protocols. Finally, continuously monitor the situation and reassess the risk as new information becomes available, adjusting the response accordingly. This systematic process ensures that decisions are grounded in objective analysis, regulatory compliance, and ethical considerations, leading to the most effective and efficient security outcomes. Question 11. Compliance review shows that a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer observes an individual pacing erratically in a public area of a federal building in Springfield, Illinois, exhibiting agitated behavior and muttering to themselves. The officer needs to assess the situation to ensure security while respecting individual rights. Which of the following actions represents the most appropriate initial response? Option A. Ignore the individual's behavior, assuming it is not a security concern. Option B. Immediately contact a supervisor and request backup without attempting any initial assessment or communication. Option C. Approach the individual calmly, identify yourself as an FPS officer, and inquire about their well-being and purpose in the building, offering assistance if needed. Option D. Immediately confront the individual aggressively, demand their identification, and question their presence with suspicion. The correct answer is C. Approach the individual calmly, identify yourself as an FPS officer, and inquire about their well-being and purpose in the building, offering assistance if needed. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the FPS law enforcement security officer to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for overreach and infringement on individual rights. The officer must accurately assess a situation that is ambiguous and could be interpreted in multiple ways, necessitating a nuanced approach that avoids prejudgment while still ensuring safety. The presence of a potentially volatile individual in a federal facility demands prompt attention, but the method of engagement is critical to maintaining professionalism and adhering to FPS guidelines. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a measured, observational, and de-escalatory approach. This means initiating contact with a calm, professional demeanor, clearly identifying oneself as an FPS officer, and seeking to understand the individual's behavior and intentions without making immediate assumptions. The officer should inquire about the individual's purpose in the facility and their current state, offering assistance if appropriate, while subtly assessing for any immediate threats. This approach aligns with FPS directives on community policing, threat assessment, and the use of appropriate communication techniques to de-escalate potentially tense situations. It prioritizes gathering information and establishing rapport before resorting to more assertive measures, thereby minimizing the risk of unnecessary confrontation and upholding the rights of individuals within federal property. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately confronting the individual in an aggressive manner, demanding identification, and questioning their presence with suspicion. This method is likely to escalate the situation unnecessarily, create fear and defensiveness in the individual, and could be perceived as harassment or profiling. It fails to adhere to de-escalation principles and may violate guidelines on professional conduct and respectful interaction with the public. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the behavior altogether, assuming it is not a threat. This is a failure in the officer's duty to assess and mitigate potential risks within a federal facility. The FPS has a mandate to ensure security, and overlooking potentially concerning behavior, even if ambiguous, can lead to a breach of security or an inability to respond effectively if the situation deteriorates. A third incorrect approach is to immediately involve a supervisor or other law enforcement without attempting any initial assessment or communication. While escalation to supervisors is sometimes necessary, doing so without any preliminary engagement bypasses the officer's responsibility to make an initial assessment and could be an inefficient use of resources. It also misses an opportunity for the officer to practice and demonstrate their judgment and de-escalation skills. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with observation and assessment. This involves gathering information through non-confrontational means, considering the context of the behavior, and evaluating potential risks. If the situation remains ambiguous but warrants attention, the next step is professional, non-aggressive engagement to clarify the individual's intentions and offer assistance. Throughout this process, officers must remain aware of FPS policies regarding individual rights, use of force, and de-escalation techniques. The goal is always to resolve the situation with the least amount of force and disruption necessary, while ensuring the safety and security of the federal facility and its occupants. Question 12. Compliance review shows that a Federal Protective Service law enforcement security officer stationed at a federal courthouse in Illinois is observing individuals entering the building. What is the most appropriate approach for the officer to conduct a risk assessment of these individuals? Option A. Profile individuals based on their appearance, demeanor, or perceived background, and subject them to heightened scrutiny if they fit certain generalized characteristics. Option B. Conduct a rapid, superficial scan of individuals, focusing primarily on obvious signs of distress or unusual haste, without delving into detailed behavioral analysis. Option C. Systematically observe individuals for specific, articulable behaviors or indicators that suggest a potential threat, and assess risks based on these objective findings in accordance with FPS policy and federal law. Option D. Rely on personal intuition and a general sense of unease about certain individuals to determine the level of risk they may pose, even in the absence of concrete observable indicators. The correct answer is C. Systematically observe individuals for specific, articulable behaviors or indicators that suggest a potential threat, and assess risks based on these objective findings in accordance with FPS policy and federal law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between maintaining security and respecting individual rights within a federal facility. The FPS Law Enforcement Security Officer, LESO, must balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the potential for overreach or discriminatory practices. The officer's judgment is critical in determining the appropriate level of scrutiny and intervention without infringing upon lawful activities or creating an environment of undue suspicion. The specific context of a federal courthouse in Illinois, governed by federal regulations and potentially state-specific privacy considerations, adds layers of complexity. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a systematic, evidence-based approach to risk assessment. This means the officer should gather observable, objective information related to potential threats, such as suspicious behavior, unusual packages, or known intelligence. The assessment should then be conducted in a manner that is non-discriminatory and adheres strictly to FPS policies and federal law regarding searches and detentions. This approach is correct because it is grounded in the principles of lawful security operations, focusing on demonstrable risks rather than assumptions or biases. It aligns with the FPS mission to protect federal property and personnel by identifying and mitigating credible threats through professional and legally sound methods. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves making assumptions based on stereotypes or generalized profiling. This is professionally unacceptable because it violates ethical principles of fairness and non-discrimination, and it is contrary to federal law and FPS policy, which mandate that security measures be based on specific, articulable facts, not on protected characteristics. Such an approach can lead to unwarranted suspicion, harassment, and erosion of public trust. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a cursory or superficial assessment that fails to identify genuine risks. This is professionally unacceptable as it directly undermines the core function of the LESO, which is to proactively identify and mitigate threats. A failure to conduct a thorough risk assessment, even if well-intentioned, can leave federal facilities vulnerable to security breaches, potentially endangering lives and property. This neglects the duty of care inherent in the role. A third incorrect approach is to escalate security measures based on vague feelings or hunches without any supporting objective evidence. While intuition can play a role in law enforcement, it must be substantiated by observable facts before action is taken. Relying solely on a feeling without concrete indicators is unprofessional, can lead to overreach, and may violate the rights of individuals who are subjected to unwarranted scrutiny or detention. This approach lacks the necessary legal and procedural foundation required for FPS operations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence, adherence to established protocols, and respect for individual rights. This involves continuous training on threat indicators, legal parameters for searches and detentions, and de-escalation techniques. When faced with a situation requiring risk assessment, the LESO should ask, what specific, observable facts support my assessment of risk? And are my actions consistent with FPS policy and federal law, and are they non-discriminatory? This structured, evidence-based approach ensures effective security while upholding legal and ethical standards. Question 13. Compliance review shows that a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer is on duty at a federal courthouse in Chicago, Illinois. The officer observes an unattended package in a public area that appears unusual and out of place. What is the most appropriate course of action for the officer to take, adhering to FPS guidelines and federal law? Option A. Immediately assess the package for any visible indicators of a threat. Maintain a safe distance, observe the surroundings, and report the suspicious package to a supervisor and relevant security personnel for further evaluation and action according to established FPS procedures. Option B. Promptly open the package to determine its contents and ensure it does not pose a security risk. Option C. Detain all individuals who were in the vicinity of the package for questioning regarding its origin. Option D. Ignore the package, assuming it is harmless, and continue with routine patrols. The correct answer is A. Immediately assess the package for any visible indicators of a threat, maintain a safe distance, observe the surroundings, and report the suspicious package to a supervisor and relevant security personnel for further evaluation and action according to established FPS procedures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the FPS law enforcement security officer to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for overreach and infringement on protected rights. The officer must make a rapid assessment of a situation that could escalate, while adhering strictly to FPS policies and federal law regarding searches and seizures. The ambiguity of the situation, a suspicious package in a federal building, necessitates a nuanced approach that prioritizes safety without compromising constitutional protections. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a systematic, policy-driven approach that prioritizes safety and de-escalation while respecting individual rights. This begins with immediate observation and assessment of the package's characteristics and surroundings. If the package presents clear and immediate danger, e.g., visible wires, ticking sounds, unusual odors, the officer must initiate emergency protocols, which include evacuation and notification of specialized units like the bomb squad, as per FPS directives on handling potential explosive devices. If the situation is less immediately indicative of a threat, the officer should maintain a safe distance, observe for any activity, and report the suspicious package to their supervisor and relevant security personnel for further investigation and decision-making. Following established FPS procedures for reporting and handling unattended items. This approach ensures that the response is proportionate to the perceived threat and aligns with federal guidelines on security procedures and the use of force, emphasizing a measured response that avoids unnecessary escalation or violation of rights. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately attempt to open or move the suspicious package without proper authorization or specialized training. This action directly violates FPS protocols for handling potentially hazardous materials and could endanger the officer and others, as well as compromise evidence if the package is indeed a threat. It also demonstrates a failure to follow established procedures for reporting and escalating security concerns. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the suspicious package due to a lack of immediate, overt signs of danger, assuming it is harmless. This demonstrates a critical failure in risk assessment and adherence to the FPS's mandate to maintain security within federal facilities. The potential consequences of overlooking a genuine threat are severe, including loss of life and significant damage. This approach neglects the proactive security posture required of an FPS officer. A third incorrect approach is to detain or question individuals in the immediate vicinity without a clear basis for suspicion beyond their proximity to the package. While observation is necessary, arbitrary detention or questioning can infringe upon civil liberties and may not be supported by FPS policy or federal law unless specific articulable facts warrant such action. This approach risks creating a hostile environment and can lead to legal challenges. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of FPS policies and relevant federal statutes governing security, searches, and seizures. This framework emphasizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and adherence to established protocols. When faced with a suspicious package, the officer must first assess the level of immediate threat. If the threat is imminent, emergency procedures are paramount. If the threat is not immediately apparent, the officer must follow reporting and observation protocols, escalating the issue to appropriate authorities for further investigation. This systematic approach ensures that actions are both effective in maintaining security and legally sound, protecting both the public and the integrity of federal operations. Question 14. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to refine how FPS law enforcement security officers in a federal facility in Washington, D.C. respond to reports of unusual activity within a sensitive research wing. Considering the critical nature of the research conducted there, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for an FPS officer responding to a report of a suspicious package in this area? Option A. Advise facility management that the report is likely a false alarm and recommend no immediate action be taken, pending further non-urgent investigation. Option B. Initiate an immediate, facility-wide lockdown to ensure the safety of all personnel and prevent any potential escalation of the threat. Option C. Immediately evacuate the entire federal facility to a designated safe zone, regardless of the package's specific location or nature. Option D. Conduct an immediate, localized assessment of the reported area to gather information about the suspicious package and its surroundings, consulting with facility personnel for context, before implementing any security measures beyond securing the immediate vicinity. Correct answer is D. Conduct an immediate, localized assessment of the reported area to gather information about the suspicious package and its surroundings, consulting with facility personnel for context, before implementing any security measures beyond securing the immediate vicinity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the FPS law enforcement security officer to balance the immediate need for security with the potential for disruption to critical government operations. The officer must make a rapid assessment of a complex situation involving multiple stakeholders with potentially conflicting priorities. Failure to properly assess the risk could lead to either an unnecessary security lockdown that impedes essential services or a security lapse that compromises the facility. The officer's judgment must be informed by established FPS protocols and a clear understanding of the facility's operational criticality. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves conducting a rapid, on-site risk assessment that prioritizes immediate threats while also considering the operational impact of security measures. This approach involves gathering information from multiple sources, including facility personnel, available sensor data, and direct observation, to determine the credible level of threat. The officer should then implement security measures proportionate to the assessed risk, focusing on containment and investigation rather than immediate, broad-scale lockdown, unless the threat is clearly imminent and severe. This aligns with FPS directives that emphasize a measured and informed response to security incidents, ensuring that security actions are both effective and minimize disruption to essential government functions. The goal is to neutralize any threat while maintaining continuity of operations where possible. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing an immediate, facility-wide lockdown without a thorough assessment of the threat level is an overreaction. This approach fails to differentiate between credible threats and minor disturbances, leading to unnecessary disruption of critical government services and potentially eroding public trust. It also deviates from the principle of proportionate response, a cornerstone of effective security operations. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the reported activity as a false alarm without any verification. This demonstrates a failure to take potential threats seriously and could result in a significant security breach if the report was valid. It neglects the officer's duty to investigate all credible security concerns. Finally, escalating the situation to a full lockdown based solely on the initial report, without attempting to gather further information or assess the immediate environment, is also professionally unsound. This approach prioritizes a worst-case scenario without evidence, leading to the same negative consequences as an immediate lockdown without assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with threat identification and information gathering. This involves actively seeking details about the nature of the reported activity, its location, and any observable indicators. Next, an assessment of the credible threat level should be made, considering the reliability of the source and corroborating evidence. Based on this assessment, appropriate security measures should be selected, prioritizing those that are effective in mitigating the risk while minimizing operational impact. Continuous reevaluation of the situation and adjustment of security measures are crucial throughout the incident. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a Federal Protective Service, FPS, law enforcement security officer stationed at a federal courthouse in Houston, Texas, observes an individual loitering near a public entrance, exhibiting agitated behavior and repeatedly glancing at their watch. What is the most appropriate initial risk assessment approach for this situation? Option A. Alert other officers to focus solely on the individual's agitated demeanor, preparing for a potential confrontation without first attempting to gather contextual information. Option B. Disregard the behavior as a potential civilian expressing frustration or anxiety, assuming no immediate threat exists without further concrete evidence. Option C. Immediately approach the individual and demand identification, citing their suspicious behavior as grounds for immediate detention. Option D. Initiate a discrete observation and gather additional information from multiple sources, including facility access logs and any available intelligence bulletins, to assess the credibility and potential threat level of the individual's behavior before taking direct action. The correct answer is D. Initiate a discrete observation and gather additional information from multiple sources, including facility access logs and any available intelligence bulletins, to assess the credibility and potential threat level of the individual's behavior before taking direct action. Explanation. System analysis indicates that assessing potential threats to federal facilities in Texas requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment methodologies. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing security needs with operational continuity, potential for escalation, and the need for accurate threat identification without causing undue alarm or disruption. A security officer must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between credible threats and routine occurrences, ensuring resources are allocated effectively and public safety is maintained. The best approach involves a systematic, multi-layered risk assessment that prioritizes credible intelligence and observable indicators. This method aligns with Federal Protective Service (FPS) guidelines which emphasize proactive threat identification and mitigation. By gathering information from multiple sources, including intelligence reports, physical surveillance, and behavioral analysis, an officer can develop a comprehensive understanding of potential risks. This allows for informed decision-making regarding the deployment of resources and the implementation of appropriate security measures, ensuring compliance with federal security directives and maintaining a secure environment. An approach that relies solely on anecdotal observations without corroboration is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of adherence to established risk assessment protocols, which mandate the verification of information. Relying on unverified rumors or isolated incidents can lead to misallocation of resources, unnecessary alarm, and potential civil liberties concerns. Furthermore, an approach that focuses exclusively on immediate, visible threats without considering underlying patterns or potential for escalation overlooks the dynamic nature of security risks and fails to implement comprehensive preventative measures. This is a direct contravention of FPS's mandate for proactive and intelligence-driven security. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to dismiss potential threats based on assumptions about the individuals involved without any objective assessment. This introduces bias into the risk assessment process, which is contrary to ethical security practices and FPS directives. Such an approach can lead to overlooking genuine threats from unexpected sources, thereby compromising the safety of the facility and its occupants. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential threats, followed by assessing the likelihood and impact of each threat. This involves gathering and analyzing information from all available sources, evaluating the credibility of that information, and then determining the appropriate response based on established protocols and risk tolerance levels. Continuous monitoring and reevaluation of the threat landscape are also crucial components of effective risk management. Question 16. The control framework reveals that as a Federal Protective Service (FPS) law enforcement security officer (LESO) stationed at a federal building in Houston, Texas, you are conducting routine screening at an access point. An individual expresses significant discomfort with the standard screening process and states they have a medical condition that makes the screening difficult. What is the most appropriate course of action to uphold security while respecting the individual's rights and adhering to FPS policy? Option A. Engage in a lengthy discussion with the individual about their medical condition and the necessity of the screening until a resolution is reached. Option B. Clearly explain the screening requirement and its purpose, and explore available, policy-compliant alternative screening methods for individuals with medical concerns. Option C. Immediately deny the individual access to the facility due to their refusal to comply with standard screening procedures. Option D. Allow the individual to bypass the screening process entirely based on their verbal assertion of a medical condition. The correct answer is B. Clearly explain the screening requirement and its purpose, and explore available, policy-compliant alternative screening methods for individuals with medical concerns. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where a Federal Protective Service (FPS) law enforcement security officer (LESO) must balance the immediate need for security with the rights and privacy of individuals within a federal facility in Texas. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying FPS policies and federal regulations concerning access control and screening procedures, particularly when an individual expresses discomfort or claims a medical exemption. The officer must make a swift, informed decision that upholds security mandates without infringing upon protected rights, all while operating under the specific legal and policy landscape, governing FPS operations in the United States. The best approach involves a measured, policy-driven response that prioritizes security while respecting individual rights. This entails clearly communicating the screening requirements as per FPS policy, explaining the purpose of the screening, and offering alternative screening methods if available and permissible under policy for the specific situation. This approach aligns with the FPS mission to protect federal facilities and personnel while adhering to federal law and departmental guidelines that mandate fair and equitable treatment of all individuals. It demonstrates a commitment to both security and civil liberties, seeking a resolution that satisfies both objectives. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny access or escalate to a more forceful intervention, without attempting to understand the individual's concerns or exploring policy-compliant alternatives. This fails to acknowledge the potential for legitimate reasons behind the individual's discomfort and bypasses established procedures for handling such situations, potentially leading to a violation of rights or an unnecessary escalation. Another incorrect approach is to waive the screening requirement entirely based solely on the individual's verbal assertion of discomfort or a vague claim of a medical exemption, without proper verification or adherence to established protocols for medical exemptions. This undermines the security posture of the federal facility and deviates from mandated screening procedures, creating a security vulnerability. A further incorrect approach would be to engage in an extended, informal debate with the individual about the necessity of the screening, or to make subjective judgments about the validity of their concerns, without consulting policy or a supervisor. This can lead to inconsistent application of security measures and potentially compromise the officer's authority and the integrity of the screening process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the situation, recalling relevant FPS policies and federal regulations, assessing the immediate security threat, and then considering all available, policy-compliant options. This includes clear communication, offering alternatives where appropriate, and knowing when to consult with supervisors or specialized personnel to ensure a lawful and effective resolution. Question 17. The efficiency study reveals a need to reevaluate security protocols at a federal facility in Texas. During a routine checkpoint, a contractor attempts to bypass the security screening by presenting an expired identification badge and stating they are in a hurry. As an FPS law enforcement security officer, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Politely but firmly explain the necessity of a valid identification badge for facility access. Initiate the process to verify the contractor's identity and authorization through established protocols, and inform them of the required procedure. Option B. Immediately deny the contractor access and escort them off the federal property without further interaction or verification. Option C. Accept the expired identification badge without question and permit the contractor to enter the facility to maintain the flow of operations. Option D. Allow the contractor to proceed into the facility after a brief verbal warning, acknowledging their claim of being in a hurry to avoid operational delays. The correct answer is A. Politely but firmly explain the necessity of a valid identification badge for facility access. Initiate the process to verify the contractor's identity and authorization through established protocols, and inform them of the required procedure. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a need to reevaluate security protocols at a federal facility in Texas. A recent incident involved a contractor attempting to bypass a security checkpoint by presenting an expired identification badge and claiming they were in a hurry. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate judgment under pressure, balancing security mandates with operational efficiency, and the need to de-escalate potentially confrontational situations. The FPS law enforcement security officer must adhere to strict federal regulations and agency policies, while also exercising discretion. The best approach involves a measured and procedural response that prioritizes security and compliance. This means verifying the contractor's identity and authorization through established protocols, even if it causes a minor delay. The officer should politely but firmly explain the necessity of proper identification for access to federal facilities, referencing the need to maintain security integrity as mandated by FPS directives and federal law. This upholds the principle of security first and ensures that all individuals entering the facility meet the required vetting standards, preventing potential security breaches. An incorrect approach would be to allow the contractor access based on their claim of being in a hurry. This bypasses established security procedures and creates a dangerous precedent, potentially compromising the safety of the facility and its occupants. It violates the core duty of the FPS officer to enforce security regulations and could be seen as negligence if an incident were to occur. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately deny access and escort the contractor off the premises without attempting to verify their identity or purpose. While security is paramount, a complete denial without any attempt at resolution can be overly aggressive and may not align with the agency's guidelines for handling minor procedural infractions. The officer should aim for a resolution that upholds security while being professional. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to accept the expired badge without question and allow entry. This demonstrates a severe lapse in judgment and a failure to adhere to fundamental security protocols. It directly contravenes the purpose of identification checks and exposes the facility to unauthorized access, which is a direct violation of FPS responsibilities and federal security mandates. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of FPS regulations and policy, a commitment to maintaining security integrity, and the ability to communicate professionally and assertively. Officers should always default to established procedures when faced with uncertainty or attempts to circumvent security measures. They must assess the immediate threat, consider the potential consequences of their actions, and choose the response that best upholds their duty to protect federal property and personnel. Question 18. Quality control measures reveal that a trusted colleague from an adjacent federal agency, whom you recognize and have interacted with professionally, approaches your security post within a federal building in the District of Columbia and urgently requests to use your personal communication device to send a brief, time-sensitive message to their supervisor. The colleague states their own device is temporarily unavailable. As a Federal Protective Service (FPS) law enforcement security officer, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Agree to relay the message verbally for the colleague, but do not allow them to touch your device or use any other communication equipment. Option B. Politely explain that while you understand the urgency, you cannot permit the use of your personal device due to security protocols, and offer to assist them in contacting their supervisor through an authorized building communication channel or by relaying a message if appropriate and permitted by policy. Option C. Immediately lend your personal communication device to the colleague to ensure their urgent message is sent without delay. Option D. Refuse the colleague's request outright and instruct them to find another way to contact their supervisor without offering any assistance. The correct answer is B. Politely explain that while you understand the urgency, you cannot permit the use of your personal device due to security protocols, and offer to assist them in contacting their supervisor through an authorized building communication channel or by relaying a message if appropriate and permitted by policy. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between maintaining security protocols and responding to a potentially urgent but unverified personal request from a trusted colleague. The FPS law enforcement security officer must balance their duty to protect federal property and personnel against the need for efficient and professional communication, while also being mindful of potential security risks. The officer's judgment is critical in determining the appropriate course of action without compromising security or unduly delaying a potentially important communication. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves acknowledging the colleague's request, explaining the current operational constraints, and offering a secure and authorized alternative for communication. This approach is correct because it upholds the FPS's mandate for security and access control while demonstrating professionalism and a willingness to facilitate necessary communication within established protocols. Specifically, Federal Protective Service (FPS) regulations and standard operating procedures emphasize maintaining a secure perimeter and controlling access to sensitive areas. Allowing unauthorized personal communication devices or methods to bypass established security checkpoints or operational procedures could create vulnerabilities. By explaining the current situation and offering an approved method, the officer adheres to these regulations and ethical obligations to maintain security. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately granting the request to use the personal device without verification or consideration of security protocols. It fails to adhere to FPS security directives that govern the use of communication devices within secure federal facilities. It bypasses established procedures for communication and could potentially expose the facility to security risks if the device or its contents are compromised. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the colleague's request outright without offering any alternative or explanation. This demonstrates a lack of professionalism and could negatively impact interagency cooperation and morale. While security is paramount, a complete refusal without exploring options can be counterproductive. A further incorrect approach is to attempt to facilitate the communication through an unauthorized channel or by deviating significantly from established security procedures. This action directly violates FPS regulations concerning security and operational integrity, potentially creating a security breach and undermining the officer's authority and the credibility of the FPS. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes security and adherence to regulations, while also incorporating elements of effective communication and problem-solving. This framework involves 1. Assessing the immediate security situation. 2. Identifying relevant FPS regulations and SOPs. 3. Evaluating the request against these protocols. 4. Communicating clearly and professionally, explaining any limitations. 5. Offering authorized alternatives or solutions. 6. Documenting the interaction if necessary. This systematic approach ensures that security is maintained, regulations are followed, and professional conduct is upheld. Question 19. The assessment process reveals a situation where an individual is observed loitering near a restricted access area within a federal building in Washington, D.C., exhibiting nervous behavior. As an FPS law enforcement security officer, which of the following decision-making approaches best aligns with established protocols and professional conduct? Option A. Immediately detain the individual and conduct a full search based on their nervous behavior and proximity to a restricted area. Option B. Contact a supervisor to report the individual's presence and await further instructions before taking any action. Option C. Approach the individual, calmly identify yourself as an FPS officer, and inquire about their purpose in the area, while observing their demeanor and surroundings for any immediate threats. Option D. Ignore the individual's presence to avoid any potential conflict or accusation of profiling. The correct answer is C. Approach the individual, calmly identify yourself as an FPS officer, and inquire about their purpose in the area, while observing their demeanor and surroundings for any immediate threats. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between maintaining security and respecting individual rights, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information or situations. The FPS law enforcement security officer is tasked with upholding federal law and protecting government property and personnel, which requires vigilance and adherence to strict protocols. However, officers must also exercise sound judgment and discretion, recognizing that not all situations are clear-cut and that actions can have significant consequences. The need for a systematic decision-making framework is paramount to ensure that responses are lawful, ethical, and effective. The best approach involves a methodical assessment of the situation, prioritizing de-escalation and information gathering, while adhering to established FPS policies and procedures. This approach recognizes the importance of verifying information and understanding the context before taking definitive action. It aligns with the FPS mission to provide a safe and secure environment by ensuring that security measures are implemented judiciously and with due regard for all relevant regulations and guidelines governing federal law enforcement operations in the United States. This method emphasizes a balanced response that prioritizes safety and security without compromising due process or unnecessarily escalating a situation. An incorrect approach would be to immediately assume the worst-case scenario and take aggressive action based on limited or unverified information. This could lead to a violation of an individual's rights, an unnecessary escalation of a situation, and potential disciplinary action or legal repercussions for the officer. It fails to uphold the principle of acting on facts and established procedures, instead relying on speculation. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the potential security concern altogether due to a desire to avoid confrontation or perceived overreach. This neglects the officer's duty to protect federal property and personnel and could leave the facility vulnerable to a genuine threat. It represents a failure to exercise due diligence and uphold the core responsibilities of an FPS law enforcement security officer. Finally, an approach that involves seeking external advice without first attempting to gather basic information or assess the immediate situation could be inefficient and delay a necessary response. While consultation is important, it should be part of a structured decision-making process, not a substitute for initial assessment and action within the officer's purview. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with observing and assessing the situation, gathering relevant facts, consulting applicable policies and procedures, considering potential risks and consequences, and then taking appropriate, lawful, and ethical action. This iterative process allows for informed and responsible decision-making in dynamic security environments. Question 20. Analysis of a situation within a federal facility in Maryland where an individual is observed holding a suspicious, unlabeled container and exhibiting agitated behavior. The FPS law enforcement security officer, LISO, is aware that the container might contain a hazardous substance. The LISO has received standard FPS training on de-escalation and basic threat assessment, but lacks specialized hazmat or WMD training. The individual is not actively threatening anyone with the container, but is refusing to comply with requests to surrender it. If the container were to rupture, it could release a toxic agent affecting a significant portion of the facility. Considering the potential for a chemical release and the LISO training limitations, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Use lethal force to incapacitate the individual and secure the container, as the unknown substance poses a potential catastrophic risk. Option B. Allow the individual to leave the facility with the container, assuming the immediate threat is not directed at anyone present. Option C. Immediately secure the area around the individual and the container, establish a safe perimeter, and request specialized hazmat or WMD response teams from the appropriate federal agency while observing the individual from a safe distance. Option D. Attempt to disarm the individual and seize the container to prevent potential harm, using necessary force if the individual resists. The correct answer is C. Immediately secure the area around the individual and the container, establish a safe perimeter, and request specialized hazmat or WMD response teams from the appropriate federal agency, while observing the individual from a safe distance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for FPS law enforcement security officers, LISO, involving the interpretation and application of federal regulations concerning the use of force and the handling of potentially hazardous materials within a federal facility in Maryland. The officer must balance the immediate need to secure a situation with the long-term implications of their actions, including potential legal ramifications and the safety of personnel and the public. The presence of an unknown substance adds a layer of complexity, requiring adherence to specific protocols beyond standard security procedures. The core challenge lies in making a rapid, informed decision under pressure that aligns with federal law, FPS policy, and the specific circumstances, while also considering the potential for escalation or unintended consequences. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately securing the area and requesting specialized assistance from the appropriate federal agency, e.g., hazmat team or the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate if chemical agents are suspected, while maintaining a safe distance and observing the individual. This approach is correct because it prioritizes the safety of all individuals present by preventing potential exposure to a hazardous substance. It aligns with FPS policy, which mandates that LISO do not attempt to handle unknown substances without proper training and equipment. Furthermore, it adheres to federal regulations that require law enforcement to involve specialized units when dealing with potential WMD or hazardous material threats. This methodical approach ensures that the situation is managed by experts, minimizing risk and adhering to established protocols for evidence preservation and public safety. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately attempt to disarm the individual and seize the container without proper protective gear or specialized training. This is professionally unacceptable because it directly violates FPS policy regarding the handling of unknown substances and exposes the officer and others to potentially severe health risks. It also risks contaminating evidence and escalating the situation unnecessarily. Another incorrect approach is to allow the individual to leave the facility with the container, assuming it is not an immediate threat. This is professionally unacceptable, as it abdicates the officer's responsibility to secure federal property and protect against potential threats. It fails to address the unknown risk posed by the substance and could lead to a far greater danger outside the facility. A third incorrect approach is to use lethal force to incapacitate the individual and secure the container. This is professionally unacceptable unless there is an immediate and unavoidable threat of death or serious bodily harm to the officer or others that cannot be mitigated by other means. In this scenario, the presence of an unknown substance does not automatically constitute such a threat, and resorting to lethal force without exhausting less lethal options and without clear justification under federal use of force guidelines would be a severe ethical and legal failure. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, adheres to established protocols, and involves appropriate specialized resources. This framework includes: 1. Assess the immediate threat. Is there an imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm? 2. Identify the nature of the threat. Is it a standard security issue or does it involve hazardous materials or WMD? 3. Consult policy and regulations. What are the specific FPS guidelines and federal laws governing this situation? 4. Request specialized assistance. If the situation involves unknown hazards, immediately contact the relevant expert agencies. 5. Maintain a safe perimeter and observe. While awaiting specialized units, ensure the safety of the area and gather information without direct engagement. 6. Document all actions. Thoroughly record all observations and decisions made.